Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully you can see me okay. Let's see. Let me just go ahead and make sure I have the, okay. Yep, I should go, okay. Go ahead and ask whatever questions you have for the exam. Sorry, I know there's a little bit of an echo in here, but it's the best we can do. So any questions you have for the exam, go ahead and put them out there and I'll answer them. I might answer them obviously slower than you type them because I'm still answering another question, but I'll get to them, don't worry. And if I happen to miss it, just remind me. Okay, let's see. Let's go back there. Okay, so ecology. Oh, okay, perfect. Hi, Ari. Okay. So the difference between climate change and global warming is really one is causes the other. I guess we could start there, right? So global warming is the idea that as the carbon emissions increase and there's more CO2 emissions and therefore more CO2 gas in the atmosphere, that enhances the greenhouse effect. And so because the greenhouse effect is now enhanced, then global temperatures go up, and that's global warming, right? So at the core, that's sort of the starting point, I guess you could say, right? Now, climate change refers to now all the effects of that global warming. So essentially, global warming causes climate change, causes like the more extreme weather, the fact that we're seeing changes now in the climate where maybe before it's hotter than it was, at a given time, or it's snowing and raining instead of snowing, all those things that we saw in the Kahoot today, there are essentially are now the effects of global warming. So climate change is sort of a broader bunch of results, I guess you could say, from global warming. But global warming is just the idea that global temperatures have now increased, and then climate change is the effects of that. Yes, climate change is the result, you could say, right? Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yes. What other questions do you guys have? Anything at all. It could be anything from the entire semester, right? Or the entire unit. But like I said, just go ahead and type it up and I'll see it and I'll answer it. Let's see, while I wait for questions to pop in. Oh, okay, Vinny. How does the water get from the aquifer to the water treatment plants? Typically they'll pump it out. So there are pumps essentially, and probably tubes, honestly. They use pumps to pump it out of the porous rock, right? And then it would travel usually by tubes of some sort to the water treatment plant, where it would then get treated and cleaned out before it cuts to our homes. In some cases, they could possibly pump it to a reservoir as well. I don't know that they actually do that. I feel like then more often than not, they're pumping it directly from the aquifer to the water treatment plant. Aqueducts maybe, but typically aqueducts are above ground. So you probably wouldn't pump the water out from underground and then bring it above ground. I would say more often than not, you have the aqueducts running from a reservoir to another location, right? So it could be going from one reservoir to a water treatment plant or something like that. But typically the aqueducts are more for once that water sort of in some sort of storage location, then it's moving it from one location to another. Probably the best example you can think of is, or I can think of, is when you're driving down from Northern California to Southern California, you'll actually see to your left on the free, off of the freeway, off the 5, you'll actually see these huge aqueducts, which are carrying some of our water from the north down to Southern California. Okay, percolation ponds, yes. Are they man-made? I would say they probably in many cases are, but they don't have to be, right? Percolation pond essentially is like a body of water, yes, that recharges the aquifer, right? It's going to be an above ground pond, sort of enclosed structure that where the assumption is rain will fall in there, it will fill it up, and then the rain will seep down into the groundwater, into the ground below, and in doing so, recharges your aquifer. So more, I would say it probably is man-made, but I also wouldn't be surprised if they just took advantage of natural ponds that were already there, right, and just let it seep down into an aquifer. So I don't know that it has to be man-made, right? Other things are very distinctly man-made, I don't know that a percolation pond has to be. Let's see. So hopefully that answers the sort of string of questions there. What's the difference? Okay, so pollution is anything where it is something dirty, right, that's getting into, we'll say, the air or the water. The difference in point and non-point is, can I identify the exact source of the pollution or if I can't? So point source pollution means I know exactly where it's coming from. Like, let's say a factory is dumping waste, like sewage, into the river, right? That's point pollution. I know exactly where it came from. It came from that factory. That's it. Non-point is the idea that if it's collecting from many different sources and I can't really identify where it came from, then I would consider it non-point source pollution. So for example, let's say, you wash your car, right, on your driveway, and 2 doors down, someone else washes their car, and 3 doors down, someone else washes their car, right? All of that, is going to flow into the storm drain. And at that point, you don't know which soap came from which person's car, right? So it's non-point source pollution. Looks like Sarah is asking, how does using energy affect the release of carbon dioxide? So it's complicated, I guess, to put it mildly. But probably the simplest way of thinking of it is, in order for us to power our electric plants right now, largely most of them are burning fossil fuels, right? So the idea now, if we're going to try to connect energy and affecting the release of carbon dioxide, the idea would be like, right now, in order to power our electric grid and our electricity and all, the electricity flows to our homes, right? We're burning fossil fuels to do that. You're essentially converting it from one form of energy in the fossil fuels into electricity, right? Which means now, if we're doing that, we are, as we try to generate energy that we can use in our homes, right, then it would release more carbon dioxide because that results in more burning of fossil fuels. Comparatively, if we were to, like, say, convert to solar power, right, then we're not necessarily increasing the amount of CO2 when we, when we get electricity. But at this point, I think a lot of power plants and such are still based more on burning fossil fuels to get that power. Okay, Sneha's asking, what is the difference between the greenhouse effect and climate change? Okay, great question too. So remember, the greenhouse effect is just the natural phenomenon where we have greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, water vapor in the air, right, in the atmosphere. And because of that, when the sun shines down and the sunlight is the light is reflected off of the earth, then some of the energy in that light gets trapped, first of all, by the greenhouse gases and sort of radiated back down to Earth. So it keeps our Earth warm. So if I had to really sort of say in one sentence what the greenhouse effect was, it's the idea, like, it's how the greenhouse gases help trap heat on Earth and make it warm enough that we can survive and it's not freezing cold here, right? Now, in contrast, climate change is, I don't know if you heard at the beginning, all the results of global warming, right? So they're definitely connected, but climate change is all those things, like the more extreme weather and all those different pieces that we looked at in terms of sea levels rising, et cetera. All of those things are sort of connected more to climate change, right? Which you could say is due to an amplified greenhouse effect, but they're not the same. They're kind of cause and effect, but not exactly, right? The greenhouse effect doesn't cause climate change directly. It's the amplification of the greenhouse effect that causes global warming, that then causes climate change. Some examples of point source pollution, I would say anything, again, where you can identify where it's coming from, right? So like factories dumping waste in rivers. It could be like, again, if you can pinpoint that a company like released waste, an oil spill, right? Let's say like tankers, when they, run into something and they spill oil everywhere, that's point source pollution because I know where the oil came from. It came from that tanker. Can I explain? Oh, thank you, Kevin. Can I explain the carbon cycle? Yes. So let me start, and I see there's a question about the natural water cycle. So what I want you to know about the carbon cycle is, first of all, big picture, it's the idea that carbon is constantly moving between all these different places through all these different processes, right? Some of the major ones, and there's technically like slow carbon cycle and a fast carbon cycle, right? Which in my class, I didn't really get into that, so I'm not necessarily going to use that terminology. But if you're listening from a different class, your teacher may have mentioned that. But it's the idea that certain things will move carbon into things, and then others will release it into the atmosphere, right? So the carbon cycle is, if you look at your carbon waste paper, that's essentially the carbon cycle. It's how does carbon move between all these different spaces? So for example, when I burn fossil fuels, that's releasing carbon dioxide and carbon, which is part of carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, right? Sort of a opposite of that, I guess you could say, would be like photosynthesis, right? Because photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide and like taking it and putting it into plants. So now it's absorbing carbon. So what you really want to know is which processes release carbon, which are things like combustion, volcanic eruption, weathering, uplift, cellular respiration. I don't know if I said that already. Those are all processes in the carbon cycle, decomposition that release carbon, right? And then I have the processes that absorb carbon, right? Which would be like photosynthesis, sedimentation, which is when you kind of pack sand and silt together to make rocks, the formation of fossil fuels, which is when those organisms can't decompose fast enough. Those would all be the ways that you absorb carbon, right? But the problem is the fossil fuel example, at least, right, is it takes a really long time to do that. So, we might be, if we're releasing carbon faster than we're putting it back into something else, then we're going to end up with basically more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, Kevin says, for symbiosis, will we need to know examples? I can't speak for other teachers. I can tell you that for me, what I want you to know is I want you to know the definitions of all three types of symbiosis, so mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. I also want you to be able to tell me, if I give you an example of a scenario, like of an interaction between two organisms, I would want you to be able to then tell me what kind of symbiosis it is, mutualism, parasitism, or commensalism. But no, I don't need you. I won't ask you like specific examples, like, oh, this animal and this animal, without telling you what they do. Tell me what kind of symbiosis. That I don't need you to know. Okay, Sarah, you asked about the water cycle, natural water cycle, and how it connects to the man-made water cycle. Okay, so, and Sonia says the same question. So remember, let's start with the natural water cycle, right? Natural water cycle means when human involved, like what does water do? And water, like carbon, naturally moves from place to place and process to process, right? So if I have water in like a lake or an ocean, it's going to evaporate into the air and the atmosphere, and now that's evaporation, and now I have water vapor, right? When water vapor first condenses and then precipitates, it falls back down to the ground, and then it might go into another river, and then it might evaporate again, right? Things like that. That, simply put, is the natural water cycle, when we sort of leave water alone and it just does its thing cycling through. The man-made water cycle is where we now said, well, we want to use that water. So how are we going to now tap into it, right? So then it's connected to the natural water cycle, because certainly all the places where we put water, if it's open, it can still do the processes, right? And we can get water from that as well. And also part of the natural water cycle would be like water falling down, recharging the aquifers. All of that's natural, right? Humans get involved when we're like, okay, well, how did we, let's say we take a river, right? And we divert that river to a reservoir. We've now, inserted ourselves into the water cycle. In the natural water cycle, there's not really water being lost in the context of like it's cycling through, right? I mean, could it still get dirty such that it's not super usable to organisms? I suppose so. But I would say in the natural water cycle, there's not as much of a issue of it being lost or not usable anymore. Yeah, human interference definitely does decrease the amount of water we have, right? Because now if you pollute the water, you can't use it, right? Or at least not for the same things. So it becomes more complicated. So that's why we often refer to water as what we call a limited renewable resource. It is renewable, right? You can it'll keep cycling through, technically speaking. But when humans get themselves involved and we're now polluting certain aspects of the water, then we can't just keep using all of it over and over again. right? So that's why we call it a limited renewable resource, because not only is it, we have tons of water, but we can't use it all for what we need it for, but also then the extra pet piece of that is when we pollute it, there's a different issue too. Some organisms do have the ability to drink water that contains salt. It's not all, but some, right? But generally speaking, if we're talking about like ocean water, they really have to have certain processes that allow them to, because it gets more complicated. If you take too much salt into your body, there's like other homeostasis issues that come up. So yes, other animals do have the ability to drink water, like saltwater fish, they do it all the time, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to survive in the water they're swimming in. But they have processes that we don't, that are going to allow them to sort of not have that salty water mess their body up and mess up their homeostasis. Okay, Kevin said, in Chippo, could an introduced species be banned? It could. So again, remember when we talk about Chippo specifically, we're defining an introduced or invasive species as an organism that is introduced into the area, but then has a negative impact on it. So there are plenty of organisms that have been introduced into ecosystems and been beneficial. We just wouldn't define it then in this context of Chippo and invasive species, because in this case, it's really meant to be, not beneficial, right? Because we were talking about threats to biodiversity. Okay, gray water has to do with when we talked about sustainable water, right? So the idea is like, right now we try to use clean water for everything. And on some level, that's great, but we can't support that, right? So gray water is the idea of like water that's a little dirty, but not so dirty we can't use it for stuff, right? Like you wouldn't want to use the water, let's say from sinks and toilets, to give it to someone else to take another bath. That wouldn't be very hygienic. But you could definitely use it to like water plants outside, right? And so that's like a good example of gray water, where it's like, they also call it like reclaimed wastewater. The idea is it's like water that's a little dirty, but if we used it, instead of just like dumping it and not doing anything with it and reusing it again, it becomes more sustainable, right? Because now eventually that water is still doing some good, even though it's a little bit dirty, but we're now not drawing from other places to get totally clean water when we don't really need it. Sugar, you said BEF? I'm not sure what term that's from, because I didn't talk about it. Okay, so let me make sure I get all the questions. So if an organism did have to, so salt is not inherently a toxin. Salt is not going to help with homeostasis, but it's not a toxin, right? A toxin is something that really causes like bodily harm, to like a poison, right? DDT, mercury, like those cause like major issues to the organism. Salt water just throws off the homeostasis, so it doesn't make it something that organisms can survive in, like to drink. But it's not really considered a toxin, no. Okay, so if you tell me what we took notes on. I think BEF may have been something about like maybe it was in that video about like ecosystem stability. I wouldn't worry about it. I don't need to know that. I need to know the concepts from stuff we talked about, but I don't need you to know that particular video watched on September 3rd. Yeah, I think that's the ecosystem, like the diversity. It's like how diverse the species are. Remember when you have like higher biodiversity in in an ecosystem, the more stable it is. But that's the main idea of what I need you to know about it. Don't worry about that term. Like, clearly, I'm not going to test you on it. Okay. A trophic cascade. So a trophic cascade is the idea that sometimes something happens at the top of the food chain, but then the effects of it we kind of see all the way down to the bottom. And so we watched a video, and you should still have the link in your notes, of the effect of when they brought the wolves back to Yellowstone, right? And it wasn't just that they now saw an impact on like the organisms that eat the wolves, or not eat the wolves, because wolves don't really get eaten, but the wolves eat, but rather they saw the sort of, it tumbled down. There was effects at all these different levels below the wolves. And that's a trophic cascade. The difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation, they both have to do with toxins, right? But bioaccumulation is more the idea of like as a single organism, the longer they're exposed to the toxin, the more toxin they're going to have in their body, right? I mean, I guess to kind of put it mildly, if you put something in poison day in and day out, it's naturally going to just get a little more toxin in it over time. So an organism that has just been placed in a toxic environment and then has been in, and another one's been in the toxic environment for like 3 weeks, is the one who's been in there for 3 weeks will just naturally have more toxin in there than the one that just got put in. Biomagnification is the idea that, well, why, what's going to happen to that toxin as we move up the food chain? So this now directly ties back to energy, right? Because the idea is when organisms take in a toxin, they can't get rid of it. They can't pee it out. It stays in their body. Specifically, it gets stored in their fat cells. And so now it's collecting toxin in its body, right? Now this relates to the food chain because now, remember, you're only getting 10% of the energy from the trophic level below. So that means you're not getting too much energy. So you normally have to eat quite a bit of molecule or organisms below you to get enough energy, which means now you're eating their toxins too, right? So I'm just going to make up some numbers. If you have a little fish and it eats like 60 blades of grass, each little blade of grass doesn't have much toxin, but it just ate 60 of them, right? Kind of like probably isn't a big deal if you eat one cookie, but if you eat like 300 cookies, you're going to get a lot of fat calories in there, right? So now all that toxin has accumulated in the small fish because from all the grass it ate, it now has more toxin, not just from one piece of grass. Now, let's say the big fish eats the little fish, but because of the energy transfer being so poor up the food chain, now that big fish isn't going to eat one little fish, so it's not just going to get the toxin from just what that one fish ate, right? That one fish is going to get all the toxin from like the 60 fish that it eats, right? So that means since you're eating the toxins getting more and more as you move up the food chain, and you have to eat quite a few of the ones below you, then the toxin ends up being concentrated. It gets more and more concentrated as you move up the food chain, and that's biomagnification. And that's why we tend to see the effects of it at the higher levels, because now it's at such a high concentration that the effects of it are being seen, whereas little bits of it probably didn't make a difference, right? But when you have like tons of it in one organism, you're going to see the effects of it. Jordan asks, when we waste water, does that mean we are moving the water to the natural? It's not that we're moving it faster than it can move. It's just that we are, in some ways you could say, well, kind of, yeah. I mean, I guess if we're wasting water, we're just not making it very sustainable, right? Because it's not that we're moving it faster than it can move, but it's just we're not able to access it, right? Because if you think about it, let's say you waste water, right? Well, that means where's the water, let's just say from your house going? It's going to the San Francisco Bay. Remember, we don't get our water directly from San Francisco Bay, so it's not like we can just pump it out of the ocean, right? Now that water has to evaporate, condense, precipitate, hopefully fall down on like a river, and now end up back in a reservoir, right? So it is not as sustainable in that sense. Let's see, Sarah asked, in the fall when plants' leaves die, is the carbon they absorbed released? No, it's not that the carbon that they absorbed is now released. It just means they're probably doing less photosynthesis. So overall, typically a plant would release more CO2, would absorb more CO2 and not really release it because they can kind of, they do both processes, right? And since they're doing more photosynthesis than they are cellular respiration, then they're, absorbing more CO2. They're taking more and more of it out. But now when they don't really do as much photosynthesis, we're not going to see them taking as much CO2 out of the atmosphere. Kevin asked about trophic cascade. So I think I already answered that one. What's the difference? Okay, so a niche and a habitat, we didn't really get into this a lot, right? But essentially I mentioned it, the idea of a niche, and then the habitat. So habitat is where you live, right? If you live in the trees, that's your habitat. If you live on the floor of the, tropical rainforest, that's your habitat. The niche is a little more complicated because the niche is sort of like saying, what is your role in your ecosystem? So that includes your habitat, but it's not only your habitat. It includes things like who do you eat, who eats you, who else do you interact with? So all the sort of things that make that organism's role in the ecosystem really unique, that's the niche, or niche if you want to use the French pronunciation. Okay, bioaccumulation. So Kevin, bioaccumulation is like, I wouldn't call bioaccumulation individual trophic level. I would just say how much toxin is in like any given individual at a time, right? Just said the idea that over time, you're going to see more toxin in a given individual. But yes, biomagnification is the buildup of toxin, higher concentration as you go to higher trophic levels. Yes. So yeah, I would say more. I mean, I don't know that they probably define bioaccumulation in both ways, right? At the trophic level and per organism, but typically it's more per organism. Okay, so yeah, let's go over coral bleaching and pHs and all that stuff. Let me start with coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is the idea that as the greenhouse effect got more pronounced, right, and global temperatures rise, then not only do global temperatures rise, the ocean temperature rises. And when the ocean gets warmer, it stresses the corals out. So coral bleaching, remember, doesn't kill the corals. It just means that it's going to make them expel their algae, the little organisms that live in them, and that's what makes them bleach or become white. And at that point, it's more like I guess for lack of a better description, think of it as the corals are just stressed out. They're not dead, they're just stressed out. So if you were to bring the temperature back down, they could recover. But if you don't bring the temperature back down, then the corals basically kicked out their occupants and they're not going to be able to survive. And so then it would eventually, if you don't return things back, it would return, it wouldn't cause the death of the corals. I guess sort of connected to that, but not really, is the idea of ocean acidification, right? I mean, it's connected because it also has to do with those higher levels of CO2. Because in this case now, first they thought, oh, there's all this CO2 in the atmosphere. It's okay, the ocean will absorb it. Well, the problem is even when the ocean did that, it caused problems, right? Because as the CO2 now diffuses more and more into the ocean, it's going to make more and more carbonic acid. Yes, the lower the pH, the more acidic it is. The higher the pH, the more alkaline or basic. Okay, and so because of that, you now end up with lower pHs in the oceans. Lower pHs in the oceans means you're going to have all the effects of that. First of all, it's going to mess with organisms' homeostasis, right? I mean, pH, if they're supposed to have pH 7, now pH is 4. I'm just I'm over dramatizing, but the idea is it's going to mess up their homeostasis because that's not that's where it's not where it's supposed to be. Whereas, if we keep it more where it's supposed to be, then the homeostasis is maintained, right? Also, you watch the video about calcium carbonate skeletons, right? That when you have a lower pH, those H+ ions are going to react with the carbonate ions. You now don't have as much calcium carbonate. That's going to affect the shells of marine organisms and things like that. Let's see. It looks like Sarah gave you the greenhouse gases, so thank you. So yeah, I mean, I would say the major greenhouse gases to know would be methane, carbon dioxide, and the water vapor, but certainly there are other ones that Sarah noted there. Could a ton of ice be able to cool down the oceans? I mean, we don't know, right? I mean, there's so many different factors to that. I mean, so theoretically, if you can cool things down, of course, it could probably help the corals. Yeah. I mean, I think they're experimenting lots of different things, right? I mean, I think the idea is twofold. Scientists want to be able to, keep the temperatures from rising too much. But certainly, I'm sure if they could bring global temperatures back down, they probably would like to do that. It's just not that easy, Is carbon dioxide the only? No. I mean, I think this is one we focus on the most, right? Methane also would be probably another one that probably could increase from various places, including like livestock. But I think carbon dioxide is probably the one that we're tracking the most because it is, it's the one that we are definitely introducing more and more into the atmosphere. So I don't think it's the only one that's necessarily increasing, but it's the one we're focusing on because we are increasing it so much more that it's having an impact, right? Yeah, I would, it's a good question as to whether or not, I think simply put, it would have an impact. How much, I think, depends on how much it increased and exactly what those greenhouses, how they function. But I would imagine so that, yeah, if you increased in amount, they would also magnify the greenhouse effect, right? Okay, Kevin says, technically, would pH count as like a shield against carbon dioxide? And when it's less, the ocean's more. See, pH is not really, it's not an item, right? Like if you think about it, like carbon dioxide is a gas. pH is like a concept. It's the idea of like how many H plus ions do I have in in one given place, right? So a lower pH means you would have more H plus ions, which could then react with more negatively charged stuff, typically, right? Or more basic stuff. Um, so that's why I don't know that I would put it as like, oh, it's not a shield because it's not a thing. I mean, it's not an item, right? It's not an entity. It's a concept. It's a concept of pH, but it's not an actual. Oh, so you're saying higher pH levels? I suppose they could be, right? But the problem is most living things have a really narrow range of pH that they survive in. So the problem again is we're coming back to homeostasis, right? Organisms are constantly trying to maintain homeostasis. So if you add all this extra basic solution to try to sort of balance against ocean acidification, now you're going to take things to the other end of the extreme, right? It's like saying, well, I don't want to be too cold, right? So I'm going to put on like 60 sweaters, but then I'm going to be too warm, even though I'm not too cold, if that makes sense. It's not that lower pH is better or higher. I think that in this case, the ocean levels the pH levels in the oceans are dropping. And so again, it messes with the homeostasis. So I guess for the oceans, a little higher or back to what it was before is good, right? But you wouldn't want to swing too much on either end of it anyways. Let's see. Does the production of food add to it can, right? I mean, because if you think about it, there's all the resources and energy used to make that or produce that food, right? I mean, if we're talking about farming and cows, it's all of, the machinery and the things that they might, they might use. So those things might be emitting carbon. Cows emit methane, when they fart. So, all those different things, yes, will potentially add to the amount of carbon dioxide. And so, they're all tied together on some level. My class, no, you don't need to know anything about viruses because we didn't talk about it. So, no. Kevin's asking what processes absorb carbon. The principal ones that we talk about are photosynthesis, what else? What is it? Sedimentation. So like collecting the formation of fossil fuels, not the burning of fossil fuels. All of those would technically absorb carbon. But I would say by and large, more processes seem to release it than absorb it, which is why we're having an issue as well. Cutting down trees technically does release CO2 in the context of like now you have fewer producers that are able to absorb the CO2. So overall, you're not going to have it, taking in CO2. Okay, let's see. The carbon doesn't turn into sedimentation. Sedimentation is the process. Sedimentation is the process by which you make rocks, basically. It's a fancy word for making rocks, right? And so sedimentary rock forms when you have like essentially like sand or silt that gets packed together. And so it's not that turns carbon into something else. It's just that the carbon is now trapped in the rock. So it's now part of more what we call the geological cycle of carbon, which is really slow, right? It's not really, you're not going to see carbon like getting released too easily from that. It's packing down into rock and it's probably maybe staying there for like hundreds of thousands of years, possibly never moving out of that space. So that's going to help sort of, but it's such a slow process. We can't rely on making new rocks to like get rid of a lot of our CO2. Jordan's asking, I don't know why they have the scale what it is. It's just the way they developed it. I'm sure there's probably, historical chemical reasons. So I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know why they would, they did it 0 to 14, but they did. And so the thing to remember about the pH scale, though, is that it's logarithmic. So it does allow you to cover a large range across not too many numbers, right? Where like a pH of 3 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 4. But I mean, in that case, we can speculate. Sure, are there other ways to do it? Probably, but didn't happen to do it. The idea technically of a carbon sink is just a place of where you would find carbon. Like where's one place it's located, right? Technically, a source is defined as like a process that releases carbon. Yes, Kevin, you should know all the 8 characteristics of life. So we can review those now if you like. So let's go over those for a moment. So the characteristics of life, there's different ways that different books will put it out there. So, kind of think of that as well. But the characteristics of life are going to be that it has genetic material. It has genetic material. It is able to grow and develop. It made up of cells. It reproduces. It has metabolism, which means it has the ability to obtain and use energy, or obtain materials and energy. They respond to their environment. They maintain homeostasis. And as a group, not an individual, changes or evolves over time. I want to say maybe in your book it's section 2-1, but you also have a reading I gave you. Yes, evolving would be, so growing and develop means like getting bigger, right? Like you have grown and developed since when you were a baby. Evolving would mean like as a species, like where you might see like over time, a species, let's say, goes from having, shorter wings to longer wings. And we'll talk about evolution, obviously, much more in second semester. But yeah, evolution really refers to a whole species, whereas growing development just means like, is that organism able to grow up and develop? So homeostasis, again, is maintaining those internal stable environments. Like it could be maintaining a certain pH or a certain water level. That would be homeostasis, right? Responding to the environment is the idea that when something changes in one's environment, that the organism will now have a response to it, like sunflowers turning towards the sun, right? So yes, homeostasis and responding to the environment are technically different. Maintaining homeostasis is sort of like you think of more internal, right? Like keeping your internal things going, whereas responding to the environment could simply just be that if something happens, that the organism will have a reaction to it. Let's see. Other questions? I think I got everyone's questions so far, right? Okay, what is the difference between homeostasis and cellular respiration? So homeostasis, again, is that idea of having a steady state, pH, water level, etc. Cellular respiration is a process. So cellular respiration is the process by which I take glucose and I use it to make another type of energy or convert it into a form of energy called ATP, which your body then, they're all tied together, right? I mean, they're not discrete. So the internal stable conditions. So homeostasis is sort of the idea of what are your internal conditions, right? And how do you how do you maintain that, right? Like body temperature is a really good example, right? When it's hot or cold, um, your body's still going to respond by trying to maintain your internal body temperature and not have it, if it's cold outside, your body temperature is still 98.6 degrees, right? Is there a definition to responding to the environment? Let me see if I can look through my stuff right now and see if I can find you like a really concise and, definition. Offhand, I think that, not necessarily, there's not specific, but let me see. Let's see, while I do that. I would say responsive environment really is more the idea that like, how does it, if something happens in the environment, will it sort of, I guess, adjust, for lack of a better word, to that? Okay, let's talk about negative and positive feedback mechanisms. Really, all I need you to know about that is the idea that negative feedback means whatever, we kind of loop back and we get back to steady state, right? So if it brings you back to the temperature that it was before, the water level it was before, whatever it might be, that's negative feedback, where you bring it back down to where it started. Whereas positive feedback is like if it makes it do something different, right? It kind of like takes it in a totally different direction. That's a positive feedback mechanism. Metabolism is a fancy word, yeah, for like converting food to energy. So it's so photosynthesis, cellular respiration, those are metabolic reactions. If we built a robot that could, sorry, someone's coming there. If we built a robot that could build onto itself, build more of itself, plug itself in, well, depends how you define that, Jordan, right? I think it sounds like it's very much close to but I don't know. I think that gets into a little more like philosophical. But I suppose if you met all characteristics of life in this robot, then technically maybe it would be considered alive. Okay. It is past 6, yes. So I'm going to go for just about 7, 8 more minutes because I have to run over and pick up my daughter. But we'll try and finish off here. So an example of a positive feedback loop, well, you have it on the papers, right? So you could kind of say a positive feedback loop would be like the one where you see, the ice melts, right? So that makes the reflectivity actually higher or lower, right? So now the Earth's temperature warms up and that makes more ice melts. That would be like a positive feedback loop, right? The negative feedback loop would be the first one, which was where you had like, because you increase the amount of photosynthesis, because the temperature goes up, then that's sort of like that little inset of the Keeling curve, right, with the seasonal variation, where you actually see it kind of bring it back, bring the carbon dioxide levels down just in that moment. So that would sort of be like a negative feedback loop. Would a feedback loop that ends up in a negative ending? I think really what you want to think, don't overthink. I know in my diagram I drew like pluses and minuses, but what you really want to think of is simplify it down to like a negative feedback loops means if at the end of it I have a way of bringing it back to what it originally was, then that's negative, right? But if it's taking it now and causing something else to happen or making sort of something happen more and more that's totally different, then that would be positive. And they interchange, like not interchange, but there's ways that those loops kind of like run into each other too. So they're not like totally distinct from each other sometimes. Do I know, Sarah? I'm not sure. I would assume a little bit because he covered it in class, right? So that would be my assumption. But I would say for you, you're probably going to want to email him just to make sure. But fair guess is I would expect at least a little bit on that. Okay, anything else? Any last minute questions before I head out? Remember, Yes, the processes can, but I mean, I guess another way of thinking about it is like typically you are kind of looking at the starting and the ending, right? Like, are you ending up at the sort of similar place you started, or are you sort of taking a detour? I mean, to make it simple, we're going to see a lot of loops throughout the year, so I mean, you'll start to sort of get that idea, right? But if the idea is it kind of keeps making it go down this path, then it's positive feedback, right? It's sort of amplifying some direction, some path. But negative feedback typically means like, okay, I'm doing X, Y, and Z, but then in the end, I'm going to bring it back to X again. Then that's a negative feedback loop. Okay, so yes, I can try to share the Kahoot. And we're still working, we're still fixing up the speed dating cards. We just had to retype them, so it's taking us a little longer. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. I do check my email at night. Remember, we've got 3 live streams tomorrow. Not me, but the other two teachers, right? So Mr. Hajarian is going to be live streaming from 5 to 6. Mr. Jones and Miss Lerner from 8 to 9. And you can always email us email me if you have questions, if you're my students, of course, and if you're not, you can do that too. All right, and then I guess that's it. My students, remember, I put a review sheet for you in Google Classroom to help you, but it's not all encompassing. So, but we'll try and post all this stuff in the next few days to kind of help you study. Also remember, things like the Kahoot are not all encompassing. Do you need to finish what? You don't need to finish anything. I mean, nothing I've put in Google Classroom right now is mandatory, right? The review sheet is purely for you to do if you want to. Yeah, so don't, it's just if you want to do it. Okay? All right, so I am going to head out now so that I can go shuttle children. And let me know if you guys have any questions, all right? And then if you didn't get a chance to, well, if you're watching, you're watching. But remember, this will be logged in YouTube, so you can rewatch it if you need to. You guys are very welcome. And I'll see you all later. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.